There's a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard or sleeping too little. It comes from people, not from a fight, not from a crisis, just from the constant presence of people who have slowly, almost imperceptibly, drained something out of you that you can't quite name. And one day, without fully deciding to, you go quiet. You stop replying as fast. You cancel plans without guilt. You sit alone, and for the first time in a long time, something inside you relaxes. Most people call this a phase, a mood. They say you're going through something. But what if you're not going through something? What if you're finally stopping, long enough to feel what's actually been happening to you? Through decades of clinical work and personal reflection, Carl Jung came to believe that people who never separate themselves from the noise of constant social life slowly lose contact with something essential in themselves. Not dramatically, not all at once. It happens the way a language dies, word by word, conversation by conversation, until one day you realize you haven't thought a thought that was genuinely yours in longer than you can remember. You've been thinking in the words of other people, reacting to their needs, maintaining their comfort, managing their impressions of you. And somewhere underneath all of that, the person you actually are has been waiting, getting quieter, getting smaller. Jung called what most people present to the world the persona, the mask, the socially acceptable version of yourself, the one that learned early which emotions were safe to show and which ones needed to be hidden, the agreeable version, the helpful version, the one who replies quickly, forgives easily, and never makes things uncomfortable. And here's what makes this so difficult to see. The mask doesn't feel like a mask. It feels like you. Here's where it gets strange. When you start withdrawing, when you go a little quieter, a little less available, something happens around you that nobody talks about. The people who claim to care about you react, not with concern necessarily. Some become irritated. Others go strangely cold. A few suddenly become very interested in you again, flooding your messages with attention they never gave you when you were constantly available. And your first instinct might be to feel guilty, to wonder if you did something wrong. But look closely at what's actually happening here, because their reaction isn't really about you. Predictable people make others feel safe. When you're always reachable, always responsive, always there, you become something people can emotionally rely on without having to earn it. Your consistency becomes a kind of psychological convenience. The moment you disappear, even briefly, that convenience is disrupted, and people don't react to your absence. They react to the loss of access. That distinction matters more than it might first appear, because there's a difference between someone who misses you and someone who misses the version of you that was always available to manage their emotional state. Your silence doesn't just remove your presence from their life, it removes their control over your predictability. And that, not sadness, not love, is what actually makes people uncomfortable. But here's something that cuts even deeper. For certain people, particularly those who had been relying heavily on your emotional availability, your disappearance may unsettle them more than your anger ever could. Think about why. Anger is still engagement. If you're furious, if you're confronting someone, if you're demanding an explanation, you're still giving them access to your attention. They can respond, defend, manipulate, apologize. They still have a role in your emotional world. Silence removes that. Silence closes a door without explaining why. And that uncertainty, not knowing where they stand with you anymore, not being able to predict your reactions, that's what certain people find psychologically unbearable, especially the ones who never noticed they were relying on your emotional consistency to regulate themselves. Jung understood that much of what passes for human connection operates not between people, but between their unspoken needs. The friend who only calls when something is wrong. The person who becomes unusually warm when they sense you pulling away. The one who needs you slightly lost, slightly insecure, slightly dependent, because your confusion made them feel more certain about themselves. You didn't choose these dynamics consciously. Neither did they. But the moment you stop performing your role in them, something shifts. And what disturbs them isn't your absence. It's the realization that your life might be continuing, fully, quietly, completely, without them at the center of it. Now here's the part most people miss. While you're noticing all of this about others, noticing who pulls away, who becomes distant, who suddenly reappears, something else is happening simultaneously. You're noticing things about yourself. And this is where disappearing becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because the moment the audience disappears, the performance stops having a purpose. Imagine someone who has spent years being the reliable one, not just the steady friend, but something more specific than that. The person who has never once ended a conversation before the other person was ready to, who has always been the last to hang up, the last to leave, the last to stop caring. And one day, in the quiet, a strange question surfaces. Did I stay because I wanted to, or because I didn't know who I was if I left? Jung believed that most of us don't build our personalities. We survive them into existence. Around one person, you become quieter. Around another, funnier. Around a group, you become the peacemaker. Around someone intimidating, you become smaller. Do this long enough, and you lose the thread back to yourself. You only know which version of you keeps people comfortable, not which version is actually true. And isolation, real isolation, not just a quiet evening, but genuine withdrawal from the noise, starts pulling at that thread. Slowly, uncomfortably, until something underneath the mask begins to stir. This isn't an argument for permanent isolation. There's a meaningful difference between solitude that turns inward with honesty and avoidance that hides inward from honesty. One forces you to confront yourself. The other simply gives you a quieter place to run from yourself. The process this video is describing only happens when the silence is honest. Jung called it the shadow. Not your evil side, not the worst version of you, just the rejected parts, everything you learned to suppress, repress, and hide in order to remain accepted. Your anger, your ambition, your resentment, your exhaustion, the part of you that wanted to say no and smiled instead, the part that watched someone receive credit for your effort and swallowed the bitterness quietly, the part that occasionally, privately, wants to disappear from every single person in your life without explanation. Most people, when they feel these things, immediately bury them. They call them toxic thoughts, immature feelings, evidence that something is wrong with them. But suppression doesn't work the way we imagine it does. In psychodynamic thinking, whatever is suppressed doesn't simply disappear. It shifts deeper into the unconscious, where it continues operating outside your awareness. This is why some people who have been endlessly patient, endlessly kind, endlessly accommodating, may suddenly become inexplicably cold. Why someone who was always the peacemaker quietly withdraws from relationships they once maintained carefully. Why a person who seemed emotionally stable wakes up one day feeling completely disconnected from the life they built. The shadow was ignored too long, and silence, real silence, forces you to meet it. Without the noise of other people's needs to organize yourself around, the parts of yourself you've been managing away finally have space to surface. That's the mechanism. That's why stillness, specifically, is what brings this material up. Not confrontation, not crisis, just the removal of the noise that was keeping it buried. This is the part of disappearing that nobody prepares you for. You thought you were withdrawing from other people. You didn't realize you were also withdrawing into yourself, into the parts of yourself you've been running from. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Most people don't stay perpetually available because they love connection. They stay available because they are terrified of what they'll find in the silence. Modern availability isn't just convenient. It's the perfect system for avoiding the one conversation that can't be muted, the one with yourself. An entire infrastructure of stimulation, designed to ensure that nobody ever has to sit quietly with themselves long enough to confront the questions that surface in stillness. Who am I when nobody is watching? What do I actually want when I stop performing what I'm supposed to want? Am I living this life, or am I performing it? These aren't dramatic existential questions. They're ordinary questions. They're the questions most people are one quiet evening away from asking, which is exactly why most people never allow themselves a quiet evening. Jung believed that one of the most deeply avoided human experiences wasn't the fear of death or failure, but something far more intimate, the encounter with yourself, stripped of social performance. Because when the performance finally stops, when there's no audience left to reassure you that you're doing well, that you're lovable, that you're valuable, what remains? Most people never find out. And here's where disappearing becomes something genuinely important rather than merely interesting. The people who do allow themselves that silence, who sit with the discomfort long enough, who let the shadow surface without immediately running back to distraction, they come out of it changed. Not dramatically, not the way films portray transformation, but something fundamental shifts. They stop needing every message answered immediately. They stop feeling responsible for managing everyone's emotional comfort. They stop mistaking access for love. And, perhaps most importantly, they begin to see. That question from earlier, which version of me is actually true, starts to have an answer. Not a complete one, but a direction. When the emotional fog finally lifts, the world looks different. Not darker, exactly. Clearer. You start seeing the hidden architecture underneath ordinary conversations, the quiet negotiations happening constantly between people who need approval, who need to feel superior, who need to feel needed, who need to maintain control over how others perceive them. You notice the friend who only becomes warm when you seem slightly lost, because your uncertainty makes them feel more certain. You notice the person who fills silences compulsively, not because they enjoy conversation, but because silence makes them confront themselves. You notice the one who becomes unexpectedly generous the moment you start pulling away, as if your distance suddenly made your presence feel valuable in a way your constant availability never did. You start seeing how many relationships are built not on genuine mutual recognition, but on unconscious mutual convenience. And once you see that, you can never fully unsee it. But here's where this has to turn. Because the temptation, once you start seeing these patterns in others, is to feel above them. To feel that you've somehow moved beyond ordinary human psychology. Jung's work points clearly toward this trap. The moment you begin seeing only darkness in others, you are almost certainly blind to something equivalent in yourself. The need for validation doesn't disappear when you become more self-aware. It goes underground. It becomes more sophisticated. The resentment you felt toward people who took you for granted? Some of them may have felt taken for granted by you, in ways you couldn't see, because you were too absorbed in your own narrative. True awareness begins the moment you turn that same unflinching observation inward. Not to punish yourself, not to collapse into self-criticism, but to see yourself, your actual motivations, your actual fears, your actual patterns, with the same clarity you're beginning to see others. That's what Jung meant by individuation, not the achievement of some perfect, transcendent self, but the slow, honest process of becoming whole, which requires claiming the parts of yourself you'd spent years trying to disown. The anger, the need, the exhaustion, the ambition, all of it. Jung believed the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. What he didn't always say directly, what gets left out of the inspiring version of that idea, is how much it costs. Because becoming yourself requires something most people aren't prepared for. It requires disappointing people, not cruelly, not out of indifference, but the agreeable version of you, the always available version, the one who reflexively apologized and kept every relationship warm through sheer maintenance. That version was built around other people's needs more than your own. When you stop performing it, some people will feel betrayed, not because you harmed them, because you changed in a way they didn't get to control. People don't resent your boundaries. They resent the version of themselves that your limits reveal, the one who was relying on your accessibility without earning it, who confused emotional convenience for genuine closeness. Some relationships survive that revelation. Many don't. And the ones that don't, their absence, though painful, tells you something important. They were built on a version of you that was already disappearing. There's a distinction that most people spend their entire lives never quite reaching. The difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the pain of being unseen by others. Solitude is the experience of finally seeing yourself. Most people never reach solitude because they interpret the discomfort of silence as evidence that something is wrong, so they fill it, immediately, reflexively, with conversation, stimulation, the warm noise of other people's presence, and in doing so, they remain permanently visible to the world, and permanently invisible to themselves. If you've ever felt the pull toward disappearing, not out of depression, not out of anger, but out of something quieter and more fundamental, maybe that pull wasn't a symptom. Maybe it was the most honest thing you've felt in years. The real question isn't why you've been pulling away from people. The real question is, who were you performing for? And what has been waiting, quietly, underneath that performance, hoping you'd finally stop long enough to listen? If something in this video made you recognize a pattern in yourself, that recognition doesn't go away if you ignore it. It waits. Drop the word silence in the comments if this reached something you hadn't named before.